and put on your headsets if you need to, our colleagues. So media colleagues, member of the diplomatic corps, civil society, and colleagues from the UN. My name is Iliko Hamos, and I'm leading the United Nations Communications Group here in LPDR. And I am honored to introduce to you today Professor Philip Alston, who is the Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights. The Special Rapporteur is an independent expert appointed by the United Nations Human Rights Council. He serves as on a voluntary basis and has no affiliation to any government or organization. Professor Alston is an international law scholar by profession, and he took up his function as the Special Rapporteur in 2014. He and his team of advisors have arrived to Laos last week at the invitation of the government. They have gone through a tight schedule of fact-finding meetings in 5 provinces of Lao PDR. Today, Professor Alston will be presenting to us his preliminary findings on the impact of poverty eradication efforts in Laos. And after his presentation, he will be taking questions from the floor from you. The final report on the Special Rapporteur's findings in Lao PDR will be submitted to the Human Rights Council in Geneva in June this year. Please note that we are recording this press conference live on a webcast, and the recording will also be available online later after the press conference. You can follow the link from the UN Lao PDR Facebook page. I would like to request that since we have the cameras set up in the front here opposite the Special Rapporteur, please do not obstruct the view of the cameras. Thank you very much, and Professor Alston, the floor is yours.
Sabadi, thank you all for coming. Let me begin by thanking the government of the Lao PDR for the invitation to visit, and by saying that I think this is an important breakthrough for the government in terms of its willingness to engage in a robust conversation about issues that are obviously both important and sensitive, and I very much welcome that. I apologize to all for the form of torture that I have inflicted by way of such a long report. I felt that it was necessary to provide as much information as possible and to explain where I obtained the information. This is deliberately designed not to be just a series of assertions on my part, but rather a well-grounded analysis. The starting point is that there have been important achievements in the Lao PDR over the past 20 or more years. The poverty rate has come down from 52% to 22% for the most recent figures, and perhaps that will go a little lower. There have been significant improvements in the availability of electricity, of water, of sanitation, of schools, and so on. GDP growth has been quite remarkable. Most countries would be very envious of a rate of 6.5% for some 15 years. And the country seems on target to graduate from LDC status. But my statement raises the problem of the nature of the economic growth that has been achieved. it's been dependent almost entirely on hydropower, railways, potentially, mining, and foreign investment, particularly in land. The consequences have clearly been good for the elites and for the middle classes, but not for the rest of the population, and that's a large percentage. What we see is that poverty rates have not improved anywhere near as much as they should have given economic growth rates, given the links that would normally exist between those two factors. Even more problematically, the type of investment has generated a large group of landless, poor people who, despite all the theory, have actually been treated rather badly for the most part in terms of forced resettlement, inadequate compensation, and highly problematic livelihoods after they have been evicted from their land. My statement then looks to the future, and this reflects discussions with many economists. It reflects a great deal of reading and research on my part. And what we see is that with the end of mining in the next couple of years, with continuing very low returns from hydropower to the actual government budget, even if the long-term predictions are brighter, very heavy debt costs linked to both hydropower and the new railroad, it is widely agreed that a new strategy is needed, and that this is dependent on Lao PDR having a skilled workforce. But it doesn't. And the reasons it doesn't are pretty straightforward. The investments have not been made. Spending on education, spending on health, spending on children, and on social protection has been very low. And the resulting quality of services is also generally very low. That doesn't make for a skilled, healthy, educated workforce, and it doesn't make for bright economic prospects. So the argument that I'm making, of course, is that from a human rights perspective, people have a right to health care and a right to education and a right to participate in their society. But quite apart from that, if the government's only interest were to be economic, then the prescription would be exactly the same. The only way that the Lao PDR economy is really going to prosper is not through more of the sorts of policies that have been pursued so far, which are very one-sided and have many problems linked to them, but through a much more diversified strategy which addresses poverty, not just for the bottom 10% or 20%, but the bottom 50% of the population. Currently, 88% of the total number of poor people are in rural areas. And it's in these areas that many of the government's economic policies have actually exacerbated rather than improved poverty. The government itself has identified over 1,750 concessions that have been made in the country. That might sound like no big deal, but estimates that I've heard are that those concessions potentially cover something like 40% of the national territory. And many, if not most of those concessions, have actually produced very few returns to the national budget. In other words, they have generated very little real revenue that can be spent on the well-being of the Lao people. And of course, they have led to large-scale dispossession. Very briefly, some of the particular problem areas. Children. There's a lot to be said about the rights of children, but again, without taking too much of a narrow economic perspective, you might have no interest in children. But all you have to know is that they are the economic future. And when we see that of children under 5 today, 21% are underweight, 9% are wasting, and 33% are stunted. It's not a good investment. You're not going to have a great workforce coming along with those statistics as your starting point. Less than 50% of them have been vaccinated. And we know what the consequences of that are in terms of lifelong health. There are still high maternal mortality rates. Educational achievement is actually very low. And World Bank estimates are that, as I recall, 11 years of Lao education translates into less than 7 years of real achievement, which means again that you are, even at the end of the school cycle, producing graduates who are poorly educated and poorly equipped to form a 21st century workforce. All of these things are the result of low investment. As I said, investment in education, in health, in social protection, in rural development are very low by regional standards. And Lao PDR is reaping the rewards of its failure to have invested. Now then is the time to change the strategy, not to focus only on attracting foreign investment and alienating large parts of the land, building very large debts which future generations will have to pay, but rather changing the way in which the fiscal system is organized, starting for the very first time to pay attention to the issue of inequality, and beginning a systematic investment in social well-being, which will pay handsome dividends. In the statement, I take a couple of issues which I think are illustrative, are exemplary. One of them is the Attapur Dam collapse. we see here something that is common more generally in La PDR, and that is a dramatic difference between the theory and the reality. So I met yesterday with senior officials from the key ministry, and the way they described the resettlement and the compensation and the choices for the people was magnificent. I'd be happy to be part of it. I'd be sitting planning the house that I was going to occupy and the crops I was going to cultivate. But that's not what I saw on the ground. It's not what I heard on the ground. It's not what the people who are deeply depressed and packed into small resettlement villages are experiencing. It's not what they've been told, and it's almost certainly not what they will end up with. The second issue is the situation of civil society, again, which I take as illustrative. In general, the government assumes that civil society is an extension of itself. In other words, it is there to implement government policy. Not there to provide any independent analysis. It is not there to stimulate reflection, discussion, consultation, participation. And the result is that there is actually an extraordinary level of fear throughout the society in terms of the free expression. But this is something of a paradox which I want to mention. It is true from what I know that large numbers of people are not prosecuted for political crimes. They are not imprisoned. They are not tortured. And this is impressive. What explains it, however, as far as I can tell, is that the government builds upon the particularities of the Lao personality, Lao culture, and uses very particular examples to send a message that resonates widely through the society. So you pick on a particular civil society leader and you disappear him and you say no more. The message is loud and clear. This man, Somphone, was preaching a very, I shouldn't say banal because he was clearly an inspirational character, but a revolutionary he certainly wasn't. An anti-government man he wasn't. But a man who wanted to encourage consultation and discussions in accordance with Buddhist and other local traditions, he was. And so the message is that if he can disappear, you can too. Keep quiet. Similarly, in terms of land disputes, the Sekong case, the long protracted story of the dispossession of land, the claims of corruption, the failures of the government to respond in any meaningful way, and the completely inadequate and unsatisfactory offers of a solution, providing the backdrop then to an act of violence by some of the dispossessed villages, the burning of the rubber trees, or the destruction of the rubber trees. And that's then met with imprisonment for 14 people, death in jail, and continued imprisonment for 9, I understand, of those individuals. And this has been going on for a long time, and there is no movement and no charges, but a clear message. And so the point I want to make is that the lack of capacity for civil society to engage in a constructive dialogue, to be debating possible approaches, has major ramifications in terms of the sort of feedback that the government gets. It doesn't get honest feedback. It can't rely on individuals who are going to be thinking and going to be innovating in any way. And it leads to a certain sclerosis, as well as, of course, a deep frustration on the part of the society at large. Let me conclude just by mentioning some of the recommendations that my report ends with. First, the government needs to engage with human rights. The reality is that the words human rights are banned in this country. They are used in connection with foreign government dialogues. They're used in reporting to the UN, but they are not used domestically. And a whole array of government officials said to me, "Oh, human rights, oh, they cover everything. Everything. It's impossible to know what they are about." And then they went on and contradicted themselves and said, but basically it means opposition to the government. We're not going to get anywhere with women's rights. We're not going to get anywhere with children's rights if you can't even talk about rights. If you take the status of women in Lao PDR, I'm afraid it's way back in another century. Women are not equal participants in anything much beyond domestic work. The role of the Lao Women's Union looks good on paper, but it's actually deeply problematic in the sense that you expect one organization to speak for 50% of the population, and particularly when the range of issues that they engage with and the sort of role they play is actually much more to promote governmental well-being than to promote the interests and situation of women. Ethnic groups, ethnic minorities, make up some 40% of the population. I think I have that figure right. 45% of the population. And yet, it is extremely ambiguous. It veers between pride in the fact that there are 50 different groups and the Lao PDR is a genuinely multi-ethnic, complex society, to a determination that their particularities will not be recognized, despite the fact that in almost every statistical indicator, they are heavily deprived. Much worse schooling, much worse healthcare, much worse housing, much lower incomes across the board. That raises the highly controversial issue of language policy. I understand how sensitive that is, but we also have to acknowledge that most, I think all of the modern research shows that children learn far more effectively in their mother tongue in the early years. Certainly women going to health centres cannot be talking about complex and often intimate matters through an interpreter or through pidgin versions of Lao. There needs to be a recognition, there needs to be a way to accommodate the government's genuine concern to promote the use of the Lao language, to build national unity, but also to unleash the economic potential of the ethnic minorities by having a more sophisticated language policy, particularly in education and health centres and in access to government offices. My report also calls for changes in fiscal policy and other matters, and I'd be happy to talk about those. And finally, I call for more robust engagement on the part of the United Nations and of many of the development partners in issues that are deemed to be sensitive. I don't think that the international partners do a favour to the Lao government by agreeing to ignore a wide range of issues that are really central to the capacity to promote meaningful development and to address the problems that exist in the country. Thank you again for coming. I'm happy to answer any questions, and I'll turn it over to our moderator to arrange for that.
Thank you very much, Professor Astor, for your insights and findings. So we'll be taking questions now, and I would like to request our media colleagues to step up first. Please, if you have questions from the media side, let's take those first. Okay, maybe there will be some follow-up questions later, so then we're opening the floor to everyone, please, and we'll have microphones, so just please put up your hand and let us know who you are, and then you can address Professor Astor. Yes, Leo Faber, please.
Thank you very much, Professor, for your explanation. And thank you. I really appreciate your remarks, and I think that is very much in line with what the European Union has been saying on many issues. I don't want to go over that again. I have one specific question, especially on the language policy, because I think, of course, this is a very complex and, as you mentioned, also a very complex issue, and it is also for our, so at least from my understanding, not easy to address it in a proper way. Because on one side, of course, as you say, it's absolutely correct that for intimate areas or children learn easier in their own language, and so, but at the same time, we also need a language that integrates. So what would be, in that sense, a more sophisticated policy on languages, if you could elaborate on that? Thank you.
There are no easy answers, and I don't pretend there are. I think my message to the Lao government is that the government of France, the government of the United States, the government of Australia, where I come from, all grapple with this issue. Australians don't want to have to provide healthcare services in Laos to Lao migrants. And so the general message is, learn English, you idiot. But of course, it's not enough. There need to be other measures in place which will combine the legitimate interests of the society in promoting a particular language with an awareness that certain arrangements need to be put in place, which will be very much to the benefit of the country as a whole. And I suspect that if you can speak your own mother tongue well, you're probably going to speak Lao better as well. So there are many arguments why a more nuanced policy needs to be worked out. But that's precisely the sort of issue where there needs to be consultation, where there needs to be real discussion with community groups. And of course the government's going to say at a certain point, no, that's ridiculous, you can't possibly couldn't do that. Next suggestion. And so you move towards a nuanced policy. But the discussion needs to open, not be shut down from the beginning.
Thank you. Further questions, please.
Yes, thank you, Professor. So once again, here I am. I believe the government has already expressed its views on your report, and partly we feel that some of the information that you receive might be biased from external sources rather, and also based on largely, part of your report largely based on NGOs and other organizations that might have hidden agendas or so on. And so it gave you some perhaps wrong perception about Laos being so bleakly painted rather in the report. None of our efforts are working, nothing we're doing is right. That is not true really. And if you have gone to the ground, you have seen some of the information firsthand, and these are groups of people, or rather small groups of people that cannot reflect the entire picture of the entire country, and also that some of the things you touch upon here rather actually straight outside of your mandates. So, and it's not really concerning poverty or causes poverty or the progress in terms of reducing poverty that we are trying to do, and it seems to suggest that human rights violations cause poverty, or accused human rights violations cause poverty, and not the other way around, or the real causes of poverty are not addressed here. Our country is still covered with a lot of UXOs. That is very also dimly reflected in your report. So we also hope that you will take into consideration when you finalize your final report that on the information and the comments, and that the government has been very cooperative in providing to you. That is all. Thank you.
Thank you to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and I want to reiterate that the government has been very cooperative, and I appreciate that. Let me make just a couple of brief comments. I think if you go through the footnotes, of which there are no doubt too many, you will find that there are 134, that it is really only in the very last section which deals with violations of civil and political rights that I rely to some extent on what you call foreign human rights groups. But that information has been systematically reinforced by my discussions on the ground with many of the individuals actually concerned, with people who are working very directly with the actual victims themselves, who have presented me with documents, who have given me long stories. Secondly, you said that I suggested that nothing is working and nothing is right. You know that's not the case. I certainly didn't say that. There are many important policies. I met many government officials who are working incredibly hard to promote the development of LAPDR. But as in every country, there are shortcomings. It's true in Australia. It's true in very, very large quantities in the country that I currently live in, the capital of which is Washington, D.C. And it's true in LAPDR. There are lots of challenges, and those challenges can only be met if they are acknowledged. You suggest that this report goes beyond my mandate because it doesn't just relate to the causes of poverty. I understand that comment. Some officials said to me that poverty is a natural phenomenon and that there's nothing that can be done about it. My own position, actually, I'm afraid, is the opposite of that. And I have a phrase which I use often, which is that poverty is a political choice. That where poverty exists, it reflects a decision by the relevant government not to address the key problems that exist, not to put more money into early childhood development, not to put more money into primary education, not to provide decent health care. And as soon as you make those political decisions and you instead spend your money on something else, you've produced poverty, or you've perpetuated poverty. For that reason, I believe that it's essential to look at the overall range of policies that a government adopts. And I think there is a very direct link between the foreign direct investment strategy and the terms on which that has been pursued, and the failure to address poverty, because the government hasn't been bringing in enough revenue. It's been signing endless numbers of concessions and investment contracts which produce all too little for anyone except the elites. And all of those contracts could have been done differently, could have generated more revenue and resources, and could have been directed to poverty. Finally, on the UXO issue, I think that's an issue that has been very well studied. It's of course an enduring disgrace for anyone from a country that participated with the United States in dropping all of those bombs. and Australia was very much part of that war. An utter disgrace, and it clearly has continuing economic consequences, but it's not the main driver of poverty in this country. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have time for one or two more questions. Please introduce yourselves.
Thank you. Jens Lukenan, German ambassador. Mr. Elson, first of all, thank you very much for your reporting and debriefing, let's say, and also the frank words. You will find certainly might come a little shocking for some persons, but I think it's good to shed a bright light on some shortcomings in the development of this country. I would like to come to, I think, a central point of your deliberations and findings, and that is why the fight against poverty in this country, especially in the rural areas, did not achieve the results which could have been expected due to the economic overall growth development. You call for a new strategy needed to focus more on the development of the human resources, I may put it like this, with in all the different fields of education and healthcare and so on, nutrition. And I'm sure that you discussed this with the officials and representatives of the Lao government. How my general take in the recent past is that these shortcomings are well understood on the side of the government. How were the reactions of the Lao government representatives on this point that maybe a new strategy is needed? What did you hear anything which would let's say, lead to a new shift in the policy?
I think there are two sides to that. I think that if you were to take out what I call the human rights parts of my analysis, and I could do that fairly quickly for you with the word processor, you would find that what remains is not very different at all from the advice of World Bank, of the University of Bern, of many of UNICEF, of many of the friends of Lao PDR who are trying to look at what future policies need to be. So I think that part should, actually be uncontroversial. I think the second part is problematic, and that is my sense that somehow Lao PDR needs to adapt its system to provide more transparency, just the availability of documents, the availability of information, etc. It needs to provide more opportunities for the expression of people's real views, and that in turn will better inform the government about what is really needed. I had this is of course anecdotal, and at one point in my meeting with government officials earlier this morning, the thing was, look, don't just talk to us about what one individual said, that doesn't reflect the whole country. And of course that's true, but on the other hand, so the anecdote I would tell is that in our meetings out of the capital, we would be in a village or whatever, and we'd find ourselves in a room, and they were all supposed to be fairly randomly chosen individuals, but of course one person would be looking a little better dressed and probably have a pen and a notebook, and I would say, and you sir, what do you do in the village? And of course he would be the village chief, who just happened to be there. And the village chief
that have been established. This is a step forward or a strategy to be built on, and what role they could play in poverty reduction.
That's an excellent question. I wish I had set you up to ask it. Genuinely, because it really raises a very important issue. On one hand, a lot of government officials have said, what you say is ridiculous. We have a complaints mechanism, and if you have a problem, just complain. I wouldn't if I were you. I don't think it's going to be a happy outcome in a lot of cases. But what the National Assembly is now developing has real potential. They have a complaints procedure. I forget the figure. It may be 468 complaints that they received during the last session, which is 8 weeks, I guess, of 2018. I think that provides a genuine safety valve to raise issues particularly relating to land and other resource issues, which are the majority of the complaints, or road access and so on. I think they need to keep working on it, because when you say, so what happens to the complaints, at a certain point it goes right back to the relevant ministry. And of course, if the ministry is taking the land or not building the road or not providing the health centre, if there's real public pressure, it might say, whoops, we better change our policy. But in most cases, most ministries, and including in your country, will just dig in and say, no, we already told them, we're not doing this, it's not available, sorry. And so that's why the countries have set up national human rights institutions or ombudsmen who are a little bit more independent and who place themselves between, say, the National Assembly and the government ministry. And they will take the complaint and say, okay, we're going to now talk to the government ministry, but try to get a constructive response. We don't want them just to say, no, 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 no. And so I would say that it's a very good development. I think the National Assembly has great potential, also in terms of some of the hearings that they're starting to hold. What I hear is that the process around the land law has been very positive in many ways. A lot of conflicting views have been heard. Government is getting information that it probably wouldn't have otherwise. And so, again, I think if the National Assembly can really develop those sort of procedures and start to carve out a role for itself with more hearings, more possibility for the public to really express themselves freely, that could be a very positive development. And it's a group that has over a quarter of women. So it is, by local standards, unusually well balanced in gender terms. So it's got a lot going for it.
If there are no more burning issues, questions that you'd like to raise, then I suggest we wrap up. Thank you. Yes? No? So no more. Yes. So then I suggest we wrap up. Thank you very much, Professor Nelson, for sharing your insights and your findings with us today. Thank you very much for everyone today who has attended. And yes, I think we all hope that this country's development is going into the direction that benefits all people. Thank you very much for attending.